Hi, and welcome to an episode of the Jet Rails podcast. I'm Robert Rand, your host. And on today's episode, we're going to be talking about fraudulent e-commerce orders and changes that we're seeing during this pandemic. People are sitting at home. They don't necessarily have their normal income. Maybe they're feeling a little brazen about taking advantage in some ways or just trying to get by, whatever their motives are. There are definitely some changes happening, and so we brought an expert on the line. We've got Rafael from Clear.Sale here to tell us a little bit about what's going on in the world of online e-commerce fraud and shed some light. So, Rafael, with no further ado, if you'd introduce yourself.
Thanks, Robert, and thanks for our audience for having me here. Clear.Sale helps online merchants in preventing from fraud in card-not-present transactions. And we've been doing this since 2001. So I've seen personally myself a lot of different numbers and different trends happening. I'm at the company for 12 years, and as the executive vice president and partner of the company, my background is in analytics. So I was there in the front talking to merchants and with merchants about the numbers and the trends and everything else that was going on in these last years. And these last 2 weeks have been pretty new for all of us. And I'm glad to share information about it and our conclusion so far.
And Clear.Sale has been helping businesses avoid credit card fraud for a long time, as I've known the company. Is this the first, not just pandemic maybe, but downturn or some sort of a calamity that you've experienced where maybe there's a change in fraud patterns?
I'd say things of that nature, of that size, yes, it's the very first time. We had in the past the Zika virus in Brazil that affected us a little bit. And also a few years ago, also the H1N1 that had, but it did have a small impact compared to that one, especially considering the lockdowns and all that brings to the table. There are other situations, though, that change behavior, like a big event in the World Cup or Olympic Games or stuff like that, as well as sales peaks, just like Black Friday and stuff like that, that change the behavior. So some of the techniques we are having to use right now are coming from past experiences of that nature. But I would say that it's pretty unique what we are living right now.
Yeah, I suppose it's going to be hard to find someone that doesn't see the current situation out there as unique. I don't think any of us alive have anything to really compare it to directly. But when you do say that you've seen other instances where something going on in the world is changing fraud techniques, patterns, just you find a rise in attempts to place orders with stolen credit cards or similar fraud going on. What is driving some of that from your experience? Do you have insight into at least a hypothesis why something like the World Cup or the Zika virus or H1N1 or any of these sorts of in some cases very different events have an impact on these trends?
Yeah, I would say that it's as much as it does affect the fraud patterns and fraud attempt rates, for instance, it may affect to increase it or decrease it. Also, it affects the sales of e-commerce in general, right? So you have some segments that had changed drastically, the volumes of orders, the volume of transactions and visits and everything else related to their business. For instance, hospitality, airlines, events, tickets are some of those verticals that are most affected by what's going on. Obviously, some of them even shutting their websites down, as well as you have drugstores, groceries, and supermarket delivery, food, and everything else with a peak, right? So what happens here is that as much as it affects marketing and every other piece of the online business. Anything that goes too far from the predictable affects, especially when it comes to so analytics intense job as fraud prevention is. So there are algorithms, there are rules that are set up on the systems, and those are we're not expecting those variations. So there will be some. We are seeing in our own systems, and also talking to merchants and people on the market, we are seeing and facing a bunch of changes. And when I compare it to the situations I described before, that's basically the same situation where you gotta understand that the status quo is no longer, is no longer the answer for whatever questions we're facing. So that's the analogy I made, where those big events and those changes pushed us into a direction of being ready to change, basically on a daily basis.
Yeah, and so part of what I'm picking up is that there are, perhaps that the actual fraudsters are acting differently, or maybe there's more of them, or something. But also that just because there's major impact to overall business, that if a
Exactly.
website is selling only 30% of their normal volume, I would imagine that the folks that are coming to place fraudulent orders aren't slowing down, and so you're seeing a bigger percentage of orders or order attempts might be fraudulent than normal. It may not be a net increase in the number of fraud attempts in some cases, at least, but it's going to feel like it.
Exactly.
And the potential impact on a business, when you're selling, I'm going to pick numbers out of a hat, but whether you're selling $100,000 or $10 million a month in goods, when you go down to 10% of that, but you still have $10,000 worth of fraud a month,
Exactly.
you're going to feel that in a whole other way. So
yeah, you hit the nail.
Makes some sense.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, there are several approaches in which the fraud prevention strategies are impacted by what's going on. And one of them, and perhaps the first one I'd like to mention, is the fact that with the volumes changing and the fraud attempts number not necessarily following the same trends, what happens is the fraud attempt rates changes, right? So I was having, let's say, 100 orders a month, two of those being a fraud attempt. So I have 2% of fraud attempt rate. Now, because I'm selling hand sanitizers or something, I'm lucky enough to be on this market in which we're seeing an increase. I sell 200 orders. So the same two fraud attempts now represent, instead of 2%, they represent 1%. So we're talking about a reduction in fraud attempts percentage, even though the fraud attempts in numbers are the same. And unfortunately, the same happens to the other side of the situation, where I'm an airline. I was used to sell 10,000 orders a month, of which like less than 100 were fraud attempts. But now the same 100 are comparable to less than half, or even less than one quarter of the orders that are being placed right now. If you add it up to, meaning a larger chargeback rate, and if you add up to, let's say, all the refunds that are coming from this behavior, like in the hospitality and airlines verticals, for instance, then you do have a huge problem in your relationship with your card processor, and a big part of that is related to fraud.
It's interesting. So I guess it's some version of economies of scale coming and impacting. And I guess that what not all merchants always know, if they're newer to dealing with credit card fraud, is that in essence you're left holding the bag. So not only did you pay whatever raw cost of the goods, but you paid for the shipping. You thought
Correct.
you had a good payment, and now you got a charge back, and that money is gone. That the credit card holder is made whole because their card was stolen, and they're not responsible for it. You, as the merchant, are left without the funds.
A lot
so
of
that's
business.
always the risk.
A lot of entrepreneurs starting business online, don't realize that this is an important part of their decisioning when it comes to online business. I'm not saying you got to be a specialist in fraud prevention to have an online business, but at least understanding that the fraud prevention affects your bottom line in so many ways. And starting by, as you said, the financial liability that a transaction that you approved, it's on your shoulders if somebody asks for a refund. So it's an important part of your cost. Let's say the average online merchant in the US has a 70 basis points average chargeback rate, meaning 0.70% of what they sell turns out to be a chargeback, a fraudulent chargeback. So if you have margins of 7%, and I'm being optimistic here, depending on your segment, right? You're talking about this line of cost representing 10% of your costs, right? 10% of our margin, sorry. And that's one of the lines. If you think about the fact that transactions have to be declined, fraud prevention in the end of the day is deciding which orders are going to go through, which are not, right? So if you're declining some orders and you know no human, no system will be perfect, you are probably doing what we call false positive, meaning declining orders that were actually good orders or good consumers trying to buy, and that can be up to 5 or 6% of the sales.
Sure.
So
Well,
we're also talking,
you want to order something for, I don't know, for your, your boyfriend or girlfriend who has a different address, a different last name, or your niece or nephew or, cousin or whatever it may be. And the name doesn't match. The address doesn't match the billing address. It doesn't look all that great. The IP address is out of range because it's not being delivered somewhere near where the order originated on the web. And so to a lot of fraud filters, it could look like a bad order. It could look like something scary to fill, like it might be a stolen credit card, someone, that's making believe that they're you and shipping something somewhere across the country. That's very common, that people don't realize that there's money on the table that I consider, I'd call it, better fraud prevention to be part of conversion rate optimization. Because bad fraud filters, something too basic, it's usually blocking good orders.
Yeah. Some reports tell that SMB businesses in the US are declining around 7% of their order due to fraud prevention filters or rules, or even manual review on their own. And it's hard for me to believe that 7% of the order attempts are actually frauds. There are fraudsters behind. I tend to believe in a number between 1.5% and 2% of fraud attempts on average for these SMBs.
Yeah, maybe if they're selling electronics or jewelry or some kind
exactly.
of basically something that you could sell on the street pretty easily, fairly untraceably. Things like that, where there's that kind of cash value. You're selling socks. I don't see you having 7%.
Yeah. I mean, we've seen fraud in each and every type of product. Yeah, we've seen fraud in each and every type of product. Much more on a matter of testing credit cards for different usage. So you cannot be 100%, unadvised. But I'm with you. I mean, I think people overreact and overrate a little bit fraud rates. And let's say if we believe in something around 2% and the average is 7%, there's magical 5% new sales that could come from that. And I would say people traditionally think about the fraudster as like a boy sitting behind their laptop trying to buy something for himself. But the reality is that most of fraud is actually organized crime aiming to resell the goods. And that goes back to your point where they will be targeting products and stuff that can be resold and that it has a big liquidity. And that's something that not everybody realizes.
That's interesting. So in essence, you're dealing with a more organized effort, and that's part of why it doesn't really slow down. It's not sporadic. And when we're talking about online fraud, and which I at least tangentially, I'd like to think that there's been a little increase since, at least here in the United States, since retailers finally started to force shoppers to use, the chips in their cards.
Mhm.
So it's harder to replicate that card, to use it in store, to use it somewhere brick and mortar, pushing fraudsters, deeper and deeper toward e-commerce for targets. But keeping all of that in mind, the people that are getting all these stolen credit cards and using them, that's not just something that yes, you can, I'm sure, get lots of great stuff on the dark web, right? I mean, that's in life. If you want to, if you want to be a bad actor, you'll find a way.
For sure.
But I'd like to think that the ones that are really out there stealing the credit card data and buying up treasure troves of it, that these are folks that are more organized. It's not the high school student in the basement or whatever.
Yeah, definitely agree. And if you think about what you just said, the reality is fraudsters understand and have the fraud as their jobs, right? So if I don't have a job into the card present orders anymore, because it's harder and harder for me to replicate a card due to the ship and PIN code thing, well, I'm migrating to online. That is much easier. And surprisingly or not, the United States were a late adopter of the technology of the chip and PIN.
Very
So
late.
look at Europe, Australia, South America. So and the good thing about it is that we know what happened in those places, and we know what's very likely to happen in the US, according to this experience. And what is very likely to happen, as I said, is fraudsters. They are not, changing their minds. Oh, now that I can't make my fraud on card present, let me find a job, a real job. You know what I mean? So they will move to a different kind of fraud, very likely still in the credit card fraud business, but now online, right? So that movement that started in 2015 still has impacts as much as the migration from to the chip and pin gets more and more prevalent into the brick and mortar businesses.
And we can hope that online technologically continues to catch up a little bit. Obviously there's the technology like your team brings to the table to help cut down on fraud. But there's also standards that have been coming out of Europe. Was that PSD2?
Yeah, 3DS, 3D security.
Yeah, that it's almost a form of two-factor authentication. Make sure that that the person using the card is the card holder, is the shopper, things of that nature. So but it's a game of whack-a-mole. It's like anything else. You build the wall, they figure out how to go over it, under it, through it. Security is always about vigilance. It's never about letting your guard down.
Yeah.
And speaking of, so we're in the middle of some very unique times. Have you been hearing anything in particular interesting from clients? Any particular unique situations, or pretty much just standard for this? Where maybe again, as we've talked about, bigger percentage of fraud because their orders are down, or some other mathematical change, but overall not a big change in the status quo.
Well, I would like to mention two elements here. The first one is in the fraud side, and the other one is on the fraud prevention side, meaning what merchants and solution providers are doing to face this situation. First of all, in the fraudsters side, let's say, the month of March has been the highest number of phishing websites ever seen. Actually, 5 times higher than February.
Wow.
And so I believe that it has a lot to do with the increased interest in buying stuff related to the crisis, or looking at information related. So people are more subject to following those traps and putting their personal data, personal information on those phishing and malware websites.
Well, when you're flustered, when you're upset, when you're nervous, when you're tired, you don't make the best decisions. So,
Yeah, exactly.
People in a crisis sometimes, unfortunately, become sitting ducks, easier to take advantage. And there's always, unfortunately, someone out there that's that's going to take that opportunity.
Exactly. And after those, and you asked me before about situations that we kind of use as experience to face an unprecedented, obviously, situation like we're facing. One of the things is every data breach that happened in the past, the famous ones like Target or even other Home Depot, Office Depot, and etc. Um, that's basically the same situation here. The more phishing websites, the more personal data available out there to the fraudsters, and they know that this is let's say a time sensitive resource, as to say, so they
It's a
want to,
gold rush.
exactly.
They're gonna jump on it now, and hopefully they get that little house on that island that they wanted. Yeah,
Exactly. So
or
they run
whatever it
to,
may be. I don't want to.
yeah, exactly. They run into it and they try to use these data points as fast as they can because they know that everybody will have access to that. That's what happened in data breaches. I would say that that there's reason to believe that a spike, super high spike, you can share with you and your audience later the graph, but this spike in phishing websites could also trigger a raise in fraud prevention attacks. So that's eventually the first item I want to share when it comes to the changes we are seeing
More
and we are
stolen
hearing.
credit cards out there to be tested. They're going to be attempted more. So
Exactly, and even personal data, meaning if you think about it, you see all those news and check this graph of coronavirus in your city, in your neighborhood, whatever. And then when you click on it, there is this phishing and malware technologies that kind of gather your data points, your data from your computer or whatever. So any data point is involved in personal information is useful to fraudsters when doing fraud, committing fraud online, because you got to pretend you are, let's say I got to pretend I'm Robert. So it's useful for me to know your phone number, your address, because it's going to become my billing address, and anything else that I know about you will, increase my chances of uh, using your personal information into my fraudulent orders. So not only credit card, but obviously including credit card. Uh, when a fraudster puts their hands on it, then you're going to have a fraud spike.
Makes sense to me. Um, Looking at it a little differently from what's going on with your team. Obviously, a lot of us in the technology industry in general has mostly gone remote wherever possible. Any major impacts on Clear.Sale, on the services that you're providing, on
Yeah.
on how you're how you're tackling.
Yeah, that's the second.
What's out there.
Yeah, that's the second element I was mentioning. Clear as well as all the other merchants and solution providers out there. Clear.Sale is facing this unique situation where people are forced almost to work from home, and that changed drastically. Situation of when you think about customer service departments, right? So some of our merchants, or most of our merchants, if not all of them, have their customer service reps as an in-office job, right? So they are using their own, let's say, their desktop instead of a laptop, personal computer. And that's a first challenge when it comes to working from home. In fraud prevention, more than 80% of North America-based uh, merchants have some sort of manual review, right? So you have technology, and that plays an important role into approving a lot of orders automatically, or even declining some of the orders based on the behavior. But when an order is flagged, very likely there will be someone looking at it, a human being, right? And Clear.Sale outsource this element, the whole element of fraud prevention decisions. And for that reason, we have almost 1,000 fraud analysts spread around the world. And
Oh,
these
is that
people,
all?
I get,
Just 1,000?
yeah. And imagine I had 1,000 people a week from now with 100% in-office job, and in less than 10 days, we had to move all this contingents of people to work from home. So
Yeah.
it has been crazy days for Clear.Sale. And when we talk to merchants and other solution providers that also have this kind of in office job as their rule, as their standard, well, the challenges are uncountable. I started by saying these people, usually some of these people use not laptops but desktops. So you gotta either move the desktop to their houses or buy a laptop or whatever. Two, a lot of these positions, because they are 24 hours a day, you have a position that is shared. The same machine, the same desktop is shared by two or more
Uh,
reps. So you don't have enough laptops and you don't have enough personal computers.
Interesting.
And yeah,
That's
and
one that
very
I don't think anybody's actually, talked with me about yet. That, the fact that you can't get a webcam right now, that they're all sold out, or, things like that. That's a reality,
yeah.
but that's really interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and think about it, customer service reps. We're talking about a lot going on via email and chat and stuff like that, but still, people want to have a number to call, and then I'm calling this person that's commonly an entry level position, right? So how many people are there in the house of these people that are now working from home? How noisy it is, the environment in which these people are now having to work from. And I mean, several challenges. At Clear.Sale, we are ready. Actually, yesterday was the day in which 100% of our fraud analysts became 100% working from home. So
Hmm.
we are kind of celebrating that. But a lot of our merchants and clients, um, especially on the customer service and not the fraud prevention step and piece of the business, they're still struggling and trying to outsource it to solution providers and stuff like that, because that has been a trend. I mean, people are freaking out a little bit on that matter, especially on the customer service side of the business, and that has been something that we are all talking about.
Yeah. And hopefully, um, I've got kids in the house right now, so hopefully, folks that, regardless of who they're calling and why they're calling, that they're just empathetic to what's going on in the universe, and that those of us that rely on children being in whether it's daycare or school or whatever it may have been, that we're all in this together, that it's a health and safety issue. So,
Yeah,
but yeah, I can imagine being a customer and wondering about some of that. Then again, I've worked remotely for a couple of years, so certain things that, I guess, certain bridges that I've crossed. Um, you know, would you say that some of the trends that you're seeing are different depending on where you are? So I know that Clear.Sale is a very international organization. Would you say that websites in certain countries are seeing more of a spike than others, or that the spike in fraud attempts is coming from certain parts of the world more often, or it's pretty much just there are bad actors wherever you are, and maybe it's plus or minus a little bit, but you just have to be vigilant.
yeah. Well, there are fraudsters everywhere. But definitely the geographical element, let's say, is very tough when it comes to the fraud rate of each country. Why? Because the fraud is a local phenomenon, right? So we are talking about someone trying to take advantage of the system, and there are at least three elements that have to do with geography that affect the fraud rates. So we're talking about belief in the system and the let's say impunity and stuff like that. We're talking about social and economic inequality that makes a pressure to criminals to go in that direction.
Hmm.
And you're talking about the rationalization. So any meaning someone doing something on the belief that it's not that bad for some
Hmm.
reason. So I'm stealing from this big organization because they are super they're huge and they have plenty of money.
Or they're just removed from me. That I don't
Yeah.
know them, and it's like a video game. Unfortunately, that we find that in web hosting that we deal with a lot of DDoS attacks and malware and hacking attempts and other things. We get folks coming over to us, for help on securing that side of their website.
Yeah. So geographically speaking, the fraud rates are very different from one country to the other, especially considering that the shipping address, if you're talking about physical goods in opposed to digital goods, is like the data point that has to be true. So you can't make a fraud from Nigeria and deliver a good. I mean, you can, but then you have an additional step of sending the good back to your country. So if you look at the highest risk countries in the world, we are talking about Russia, Brazil, Mexico, and Nigeria are the famous names that will come to our minds. So they're pretty spread in the world. So fraud varies a lot geographically speaking. When it comes to the effects of the corona thing in the fraud rates, then we still did it. It's early to make conclusions, but because Clear.Sale, as you said, has a global presence, we have customers in the eastern side of the world, and most importantly, customers in the US and North America that deliver to these countries. And the effect on those countries and the volume of orders has been much earlier there, right? So Japan and China are the two biggest destinations of one of our largest customers out of Canada, and the volume of these particular customers, especially when it comes to the orders going to that direction, the decrease was huge, and it happened actually 3 weeks ago. Started happening 3 or 4 weeks ago. So I would say those effects that we mentioned,
maybe,
yeah. So those effects that we mentioned before about variations in volume impacting the fraud rates started happening in earlier for some countries than others. But I tend to believe that all of them are going to face similar challenges.
So if we're speaking to merchants that are jumping into e-commerce because their brick and mortar sales channels are not able to service customers the same way, what would some of those telltale signs be if they're manually reviewing an order and scratching their head trying to think, is this a good order? Is it a bad order? Should I fill it? Or should I not fill it? What are some of those things that are pretty visible from your perspective?
Mm-hmm. Well, the first thing is fraud prevention is a complex topic, and I would say that technology will play a very important role there, especially to flag only the risky orders and allow the non-risky orders to go through without the risk of being delayed or being declined by a decision made by a human being. However, the human aspect, the human touch of it, still plays an important role. As I said, more than 80% of the merchants in the US have some sort of manual review as part of their decision flow, and that has to do with the fact that we are all talking about machine learning, and I myself am a statistician, a data scientist. So as much as I rely on it, I know that the machines learn what we teach them, right? So you gotta have someone saying which orders are fraudulent, which are not, so that the algorithms train themselves and are able to replicate this behavior. That said, the formula, let's say, that we all believe in most of the fraud prevention specialists is approving as much as you can automatically, meaning letting your algorithms and a solution provider or an internal bunch of rules, whatever a merchant wants, so that you only flag the risky orders, then you put a human being to review it. When it comes to reviewing it, then goes back to your question, in what should you look at when trying to manually review? And then obviously it's a multi-factor verification. You got to look at mainly many source of information, but I would say the most important one is the link between the data points, right? So Does it make sense? This email address linked to this phone number. Does this shipping address has this shipping address been used with this name before? Has this credit card been used with how many different phone numbers? So most of the variables and the data points and rules understood used during this process are going to be related to these links between the different data points.
Mm.
And that's why there are so many, and that's why looking at algorithms tends to be a good response to
Well,
that.
and now there's so much data out there, that even social media data that ties back
Correct.
with people. So it's more than just what it might have been. I don't know. I don't want to go back to the Stone Age when I got into e-commerce, but but in earlier days.
Yeah, definitely. The standard way of preventing fraud 10 years ago was a rules-based systems, right? So you had the in-house, especially the enterprise level merchants had their in-house systems developed internally, uh, basically based on rules, right? So does this match with that? How much is this order? Does it make sense? The complexity and the availability of data points and information is increasing so much that it's so hard to manage these rules. How do you sort them? Okay, it fell into this rule that seems to be a good thing. Like, let's say this credit card was used in this shipping address before, but at the same time is a proxy IP out of Russia. So how do you add up those two? And if if you have a rules-based system, the technology answered to this challenge by kind of weighting those two variables and multiple others through an algorithm, and that's what we call machine learning or artificial intelligence. So you still include all those variables and those common sense knowledge into your models, but now you let technology tell you how much each of these weight in the final score that will define whether or not the order is going to be approved.
Yeah. And look, I know that models like the system that Clear.Sale has brought to the market for years, that your team can even ensure that the orders are going to be safe, that you're allowing through. That that there's some good stuff out there for folks that are really on the front lines and worried about the impact it's going to have on their business. Um, I know none of us are clairvoyant. We don't know exactly what's coming around the corner. If life has ever taught us that, it has now. Do you have any other recommendations, tips, ideas, things that you think people should be aware of or be on the lookout for?
Sure. Well, I think there's two things. First, when it comes to fraud prevention, in any complex topic, I believe that the world is going through a change. It has been through a change in the last few years. And my overall recommendation is to find the right partners and people that understand pretty well what they're doing before not necessarily trying to do yourself the different aspects of your business. And fraud prevention is no different. So looking for the right partner to outsource or not the decision, either if it's a system, a partner that provides you with more information for a conscious decision, whatever level of help you will choose, look for some help. The fraud prevention, customer service, digital marketing, whatever, because nobody knows everything, right? So at
Well,
Clear.Sale,
and if you're tied down on too many things, you really can't focus on growing the business, on
exactly.
doing what you're supposed to be doing to be successful. You can't double down on supporting your customers while you're dealing with every technical aspect. So.
Yeah, increase your sales and deliver good products and do good marketing campaigns already is hard enough so that you don't have to deal with some other stuff, right? So I'm a big fan of outsourcing and looking at partners that build a win-win type of relationship and stuff like that. And that's my first, let's say, takeaway. Secondly, I wanna mention my optimism about what's going on with everything, especially when it comes to the e-commerce environment where we are all inserted. right? So I believe that the short term, we're going to see kind of an economic recession, and that will affect obviously retailer and in particular e-commerce. But after that, and after this wave comes, I believe that we are all sitting into a seed that is going to keep growing, right? So the fact that everybody's working from home, the fact that people are buying online that never bought before, are bringing those facts are bringing new buyers to the table, and people buying things that they were not trusting enough in the system and in the e-commerce channel to buy before, and now they are trusting. So I think we that work in the online space have to look at it as an opportunity. If you think about the sizes and the space that the U.S. E-commerce still has to grow, if you compare to countries like uh, uh, the United Kingdom, where 30% of the retailer is through the online channel, while in the US is less than 20%. Any change any migration from regular brick and mortar retailer to e-commerce will make a big impact, right? So if we're talking about 1% of retail business going to migrating to e-commerce, that already represent more than 4% an increase in the e-commerce space, because of how different the size of these two big sources of business are. So I look at this in a very optimistic way, especially understanding the fact that we are working in the online space, and I see good things coming.
Yeah, well, I think we all need to keep our eye on the future. That there's a lot out there, to be optimistic about. And I do think that, in terms of long-term productivity, the ability to not commute an hour each way and to spend more time just diving into work and being with family, other things that I think that people are going to learn from this experience. Maybe it means that they go into the office 3 days a week, not 5. I think there's going to be a lot of conversation as a society about a lot of different things of that nature that are going to hopefully have positive impacts. In the meantime, we're really appreciative, Rafael, for you coming on the podcast on short notice to talk about what you and your team are seeing in terms of fraud. And I want to extend to our listeners and viewers that as I'll continue to in episodes, we're going to keep doing our best to tackle timely topics that can help businesses in the short term with what they're facing. And we are also going to continue to try to bring resources to you. I know that both Clear.Sale and JetRails are involved in a project called offline-to-on.com, where there are now over 1,000 e-commerce professionals, e-commerce experts of different sorts and representatives of different businesses that support the e-commerce ecosystem banded together to help bring merchants that were not online into e-commerce and help them basically triage in a rush to get the resources that they need. Lots of volunteers participating, lots of tech companies with unique offers going through that group. There are also other programs available. We'll add some links in the description to the episode in the show notes. At JetRails, we have an initiative through one of our teammates, Tom Pachalski, to help merchants that are already up and running, but that are facing new or different challenges than what they've experienced in the past, whether that's trying to get set up with buy online, pick up in store, or changes in website traffic, or fraud, or whatever it may be. We want to route you to the right resources and help make sure that that while a lot of people out there are hurting, it's not because there's a lack of resource or folks that want to help. So with that, stay safe, stay healthy, and happy selling.